In today's video, you guys, I am going to discuss and challenge the idea that modifications actually diminish the value of all vehicles. And later on in the video, I'm also going to lay out some really good tips for anyone who is looking to sell their car, especially those of you who already have modifications on them. So let's get right into it. To some, the idea that quality modifications can actually increase the value of a vehicle may seem obvious. However, from what I have witnessed personally online, it is clear that there is a vast amount of people that truly believe no matter what the modification is or the quality that it maintains, the moment the vehicle is modified, the value has tanked. Now, obviously, if you are only buying AliExpress, eBay, and Amazon parts for your car, it is likely not going to skyrocket in value. Honestly, it's going to dip majorly. But I do think that there are quality modifications by reputable companies that will actually attract specific buyers that are willing to pay a bit more, ultimately increasing the vehicle's value. I'll list some of the part manufacturers that I think actually will increase some of the vehicle's value, as well as the types of modifications that may bring in a bit more cash. Now, will the modifications that you buy get you all of your money back? Probably not. To be honest, the majority of modifications that you're putting on a car are going to be a waste of money from a financial standpoint. Unless, of course, those modifications are incredibly rare, discontinued, or impossible to find, and you capture the attention of a unique buyer who wanted that exact spec car with those exact aftermarket parts. But ultimately, no, you'll never get that money back. However, as I mentioned before, there are examples of modifications that will bring in the right buyers at an increase of price. For example, let's say that I am searching for an F80 M3, but I have a specific spec in mind and I like to add just a few tasteful mods down the road and leave the car at that. If I find that spec and it's already outfitted with some of the modifications, I'm actually willing to pay a bit more because I know if I were to find a stock car at that same price, I'm just going to sink that extra $10,000 in parts eventually down the road. Here's a good idea of some of the modifications on the ideal spec car that I would pay a bit more for. Number one would be a pinned crank hub. The parts and the labor for a pinned crank hub is roughly around $3,000 to $4,000 over here on the East Coast. Even Venturi intakes or charge pipes are also modifications that I would want to have on my car at some point. Active Auto Works single mid pipe or even the equal length mid pipe. BBS or Volk wheels. These are both worth good money and seem to hold their value really well. And lastly, KW or Öhlins suspension. If I found the exact spec car that I wanted and it had those specific modifications on it, I'm willing to pay a bit more because I know I'm going to want those modifications on the car anyways. These mods make this car more attractive to me. Personally, as far as the amount of modifications that I would prefer on the car, this would be the cutoff for me. I wouldn't want it overdone, just a few that I know I would do down the line anyways. The first modification that I had mentioned was the pinned crank hub. This is an especially attractive modification because of how expensive it is. I see pinned F8X cars going for more online all of the time because for most owners, they're going to want that done anyways. I also see a lot of F8X want to buy posts where buyers are specifically asking for the car that they are looking for to have the crank hub pinned. It's attractive because this is just a well-known issue in the S55s. If I know I'm going to do this regardless, I'll pay a fraction of its original price on top of the asking price to save me some cash down the road. Value is obviously going to be different for a private buyer versus a dealership trade-in. If I'm selling my car to a dealership, then no. Mods will never add value and the car will be what it's worth on paper. A dealership also thinks that my E92 M3 is only worth $12,000 when it goes for $26,000 to $30,000 all day in the private market. Not to say that they're wrong, but they are just running the numbers off of the Kelley Blue Book value, when we all know that some of these cars just go for much more in the real world. So we have to be honest about how we intend on selling the car and to whom. If I am selling a car to a dealership, I am removing all of the parts and I'm selling them privately. There's just no sense in me leaving those modifications on the car and losing all of that money when I could just take the modifications off and sell them on my own. This brings me to one of my next points: never sell your OEM stock parts off of your vehicle. And and this is exactly why. At some point, you will more than likely sell the car, and you'll wish that you could just go back to stock and sell off your aftermarket parts. Most people would prefer to have the OEM parts on the car, so to make sure that the car still has value when you go to sell it, you're gonna want those OEM stock parts. I will also never sell my vehicle to a dealership with a wrap. This will completely diminish the value of the car. There's really no way for anyone to see the quality of the paint that is underneath the wrap on the car. They would just have to take my word for it. For me, personally, I would also never buy a wrapped car. There are just way too many risks associated with that. When it comes to private sale, I will remove the parts that I think won't bring more value to the car, or I could just reuse them down the road on one of my future builds, or I'll just sell them off privately because they're not gonna bring any more value to the car. I will say that the majority of people that are shopping for performance cars do in fact want a stock car. This typically suggests less tampering and less abuse. At least that's the way it is from a visual standpoint. So if you are thinking about leaving your GTS taillights and your yellow DRLs on, you may as well just take them off the car. With modifications like that, you're just going to attract less buyers and open up the suggestion of tampering. This has been my experience with buying, modifying, and selling cars over the past 20 years. I remember when I sold my F30 328. It had loads of modifications on the car. Now, I was actually able to sell that car for about $2,000 more than what I originally paid for. This was after 5 years of ownership and adding another 40,000 miles onto the odometer. I definitely lost money on the amount of modifications that I left on the car, but the car did bring a solid price, much more than I had originally anticipated. My E90 M3, I actually lost money on. This was at the beginning of COVID, and there were just a lot of questions regarding the future of finances and what was going to happen with the economy, so I wanted to play it safe. I had two cars at the time, the M2 and the M3 E90. In an effort to offload the M3, I took what I could get and ended up selling the car for $25,000. I paid $26,000 originally about a year prior. The car had rod bearings done, full body PPF, some tasteful modifications. It wasn't overdone, but overall that car was definitely a loss for me. I like to think that it paid me back in content and memories, but financially it was sort of a mess. My M2 actually sold for the same price that I bought it for. I ended up selling that car to a dealership. However, I did in fact remove all of the modifications and sold them separately. The F87 M2 actually increased in value in the time that I had owned the car, so it was a pretty easy sell for me. The next car that I bought was the Supra, and this was a similar story. I bought the car for $52,000. A year later, I actually sold the car for $52,000. I removed all of the parts and I sold them separately. The E36 M3 was a different story. I bought that car for $5,500 at a car show, and then I sold it a year later to a dealership for $26,000. Now, the dealership that I sold it to, the owner is a good friend of mine. He buys a lot of my cars, and they sort of specialize in selling modified vehicles and just unique spec cars, things of that nature. So any other dealership would never have offered me $26,000, but the owner actually wanted to buy this car for himself. Now, the car did have a good deal of modifications on it. Honestly, I put so much time into rebuilding that car, but when it came down to it, I did actually make money on the car, and I just left the modifications on. It was sort of a package deal. The next car was the BMW F30 340. Now, I bought that car for $28,000, and a year later, I sold it for $43,000 privately. Technically, it was through consignment, but a private buyer did end up buying the car. I left the modifications on that car as well because the buyer specifically asked to have them on the car. The car was more valuable to him with those modifications, and furthermore, he was willing to pay a bit more with those modifications. The M4 GTS was different, however. I did buy that car for about the same price that I sold it for. However, it was a much more difficult sell just because of the nature of the vehicle. Most dealerships looked at that car and valued it at the price of a normal M4 and not a GTS. I think CarMax offered me like $28,000 for it. I also had an offer from a local BMW dealership, but this was closer to the amount that I had originally paid for the car, just a little bit less. I had a meeting with them, told them them what car I had. I brought them the car. They did a full inspection. They drove it. They went through the car meticulously right in front of me and offered me a price. I thought the offer was fair, so I accepted it. I took an Uber home and they ended up taking in the vehicle. A week later, I get a call from the manager at this BMW dealership telling me that they could no longer honor the deal because the car had a tune on it. Now, it actually did not have a tune on it at the time because I had removed the tune a few months prior, flashed back in the stock GTS tune, and relocked the DME. But since the car had been tuned at one point in its life, they no longer wanted the vehicle. They also asked me why the roll cage was missing from the car, and I explained to them that the previous owner removed the car from the cage and this was just how I bought the car. This was all completely true and documented. I was a bit confused as to how they went through their entire inspection in front of me, accepted the vehicle, and they never even realized this. Nonetheless, I ended up taking that car back from the dealership and ended up finding another dealership to buy the car. They ended up offering me a bit more than the previous dealership, so it was a win-win for everyone. Even though it wasn't a pristine example of an M4 GTS because of its history, it was still an absolute beast of a car, and I miss it to this day. I think it's for sale in Ohio now for like $68,000, which just makes me sad. So overall, you guys, this has been my experience buying and modifying and selling BMWs over the past 10 years. I lost money on some, made money on others, but I managed to get back what I paid on a few. The modifications really only helped in certain private party sales. And to be completely honest, these modifications that I had on these cars weren't really top of the food chain modifications, but I suppose they were decent enough. When I was actually considering selling my E92 M3 a few months back, I made a video saying I was going to list it at $28,000. I had offers for that car after that video well into the mid $30,000 range. And all of the buyers were very specific about leaving the modifications on that car. I think ultimately they just really liked the modifications and knew that at some point they would want to do something similar. So to them, that increased the value of the car. Ultimately, I did decide to keep the E92 M3 just because I love it so much. But this was a clear example that some people were willing to pay more for the car if I had left the modifications on. So tell me down below, you guys, what has your experience been selling and buying performance vehicles? Do you prefer modifications? Do you prefer untouched cars? Do the right mods bring more value for you? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. But anyways, if you guys enjoyed this video, please make sure you like the video. It does a lot for the channel and helps out with the YouTube algorithm. If you guys feel like supporting the channel in any way, there's going to be merch linked down below. Make sure you check it out. But that is going to wrap this video up. See you in the next one. Peace.